Howdy, hey folks. My name is Mario. I'm the lead developer for the Chaos Recipe Enhancer. I wanted to put out a quick video to help guide folks through the installation and setup for this tool. I also realize there's a ton of questions that could easily be answered through a couple of quick explanations and demos. So sit back and enjoy. Before installing the tool, you want to make sure that you have the .NET Framework runtime installed on your machine. We put a link for this in our README, and you can go ahead and install this as needed. A lot of the times, people already have this installed for other software, so you may or may not see this warning message depending on your situation. After that, you can head over to our latest release. This is commonly seen here on the right-hand sidebar of our GitHub repository. Go ahead and click on this. We have a hefty changelog. What we're looking for, though, is here the assets. So in the assets, there's a setup.msi file that you'll want to click on and download and run. Now you're probably going to see a security warning like this one, since this is an unsigned executable from quote unquote unknown publisher. Go ahead and run that anyways. And if you have third party antivirus and other rules applied to your system security, you do want to double check that nothing gets blocked as a part of the installation process. After this, we're just going to run through the installer, change where we want to install it to if needed, and let it do its thing. You'll probably get another security prompt here like this, and we're done. After this, the app should be good to run. All right, so we just installed the app and we want to get it set up so we can start using it. First things first, we do need to hook up our Path of Exile account to our tool. So I'm just going to go ahead and start putting in some pretty basic data, my account name. Next, we're going to put in something called a PoE session ID. All this is establishing a connection through Path of Exile's website's cookies to their backend APIs. And we're actually just going to straight up extract the cookie that the web client, their website, uses to do that. So I went ahead, I'm just on pathofexile.com, and I am in the developer tools. So if you hit F12 on most browsers, you're going to be able to see this. On the top bar here of the developer tools, you want to make sure you're on the application tab. And on this left side, there's a section here for cookies, specifically pathofexiles.com's cookies. We're going to see a row for PoE sesh ID. We're going to want to take that value and paste it into our app. Now you're going to see that this cookie is not going to last until the end of time. If you find yourself getting a 403 or forbidden error, some sort of access issue, the first thing you're going to want to try to do is regenerate this key by going back to the Path of Exile website and repeating this process. But once you go ahead and put that key in, we can move on to the league selection. Now you can see a pre-populated list of leagues that are, generally speaking, the leagues supported by GGG. So standard, hardcore, SSF. When Lake of Kalandra launches, which is the upcoming league, um, those leagues and their respective, hardcore flavors, SSF flavors, they will all show up here. So you will see the full list. We also support custom leagues. So if you're playing in anything with your buddies that doesn't show up on this pre-populated list, you can tick this checkbox and type out the league name, and it all should come up. You do want to triple check that spelling, though. We have had people in the past come to us um, saying how they are unable to query into certain stashes, and it's because they had typos in their league names. So that's it for the account settings. So taking a look at this recipes tab, you can see that we support a couple of different currency generation recipes, including, of course, the Chaos Orb recipe, the Regal recipe, the Exalted Shard recipe, and we also allow you the opportunity to include identified items when handing in items for all the recipes. The Regal and Chaos Orb recipe are mutually exclusive, but you can track, say, the Chaos Orb recipe and the Exalted Shard recipes at the same time, since they track a completely different class of item. So next up, we're going to take a look at the General tab here. We're starting with the full set threshold, which is a number that you're able to define that tells the app when it's time to stop farming and turn in your sets for currency. You can leave it at 0, and we'll try to do a calculation based on the theoretical amount of sets you can physically fit into a stash tab based on whether it's a quad tab or a normal tab. There's a little bit more information on how we do that if you hover over the setting. And a good note is that most settings should have a tooltip when you hover over it that tries to describe a little bit more of what it does in depth. So for testing, I'm going to go ahead and put 1 as my full set threshold. Next, we're moving on to the target stash. With our most recent update, we added support for querying into a guild stash, as well as, of course, your own personal stash. I'm going to keep it to my stash. Next is something called the stash tab query mode. This is telling the app how to look up for a given tab or a collection of tabs. Now, the most common cases are going to be using a prefix or a suffix, and this is on the tab name. So in the case of having multiple tabs where I want to have them, let's say with the prefix of chaos, chaos 2, this actually won't work because it's a currency tab, but whatever. Um, I can now use that prefix to search my entire stash, and all the tabs that are named chaos and then something are going to pull as possible containing possible items that I can turn in for chaos. And of course, it works the same way for suffixes. So if I put whatever chaos or whatever word I define here, it'll work the same way. Now, this is all fine and dandy when I have the ability to rename my tabs using premium tabs. But what if I don't have premium tabs? What if I just have normal tabs that I can't rename? Well, that's where this first option, the ID, comes into play. Because of the way numbering works in a lot of the software world, the first is actually 0. So if I'm wanting to query the first tab in my stash, which is this non-renamable normal tab, I would go ahead and put the value of 0 for the index. So you count upward starting at 0. And you are able to add multiple of these indices for this stash query mode, up to 6 to be specific. So you could have, let's say, up to your 4, 0, 1, 2, 3 normal tabs that come by default with the free to play version of the game. So all the setup we've done thus far is actually all the setup you need to do to run the core functionality of the app, which is querying into the stash and getting an overlay that tells you which items to pick to turn in for currency. So I'm actually going to go ahead and run my overlay with this bottom right hand side button here. And this actually runs one of two overlays from the app. This is the set tracker overlay. It spins up and it defaults to 0 for the values because we do have to fetch before we're able to do anything here. We got to fetch the data from GGG's Stash API. And I'm actually going to go ahead and do that. Awesome. I've fetched and I can see here that I've been notified by the app that I do have full sets, or one set in this case. And I can actually go ahead and head over to my tab in game. And once I am in my tab, I can hit this stash overlay button, and the stash tab overlay pops up with the first item in my set ready to pick up. So I'm actually gonna clear my turn. Just gonna go ahead and start putting stuff in my tab, and you can see that the highlighting works in real time, and I'm notified when I've collected the full item set. Now, a lot of what I just walked through is super customizable, including this stash tab overlay. If you need to resize it for different screen sizes, you can see that there is an edit button for this overlay up top here that allows you to resize as needed. This set tracker overlay has a couple of different display modes, including a couple of vertical modes, a minimal mode, a buttons only mode if you don't want to see any of the actual trackers. Um, Tons and tons of different ways you can use the app. I'm going to go ahead and rehide this, and we're going to talk to the vendor. And you can see that I'm able to turn in a set for 2 chaos. The next feature I want to talk about quickly is the fetch on new map feature. So all this is it's actually using the client.txt file that's located in the Path of Exile installation location. This varies between the standalone client and the Steam client and others. But once you have this setting enabled and the file hooked up, the app is actually able to listen to when you are rezoning, when you're mapping or trading or whatever the case may be. Um, Often do I find myself kind of just in the zone, doing my thing, putting stuff into my dump tab. Let's say I go out for a trade. Whoops, I need to do that manually. And while I'm doing other stuff, the app actually went ahead and notified me that, hey, by the way, you have sets ready to turn in. Feel free to do that as one normally would. Just want to clarify a little bit about how the Stash tab API actually works in terms of updating data and how often that can happen. So I have a case here where I'm actually going to refetch from my dump tab. And so you can see that I have close to a full set. I am missing a single helmet. I have 0 helmets so far. And in the case where you're, spending some time in the hideout, you're not in maps, you are, sorting through things, and you say, "Oh, cool! Like I'm close to completing this set. I do have another unidentified helmet that I can use for this set. I'm gonna put it in the dump tab so I can go ahead and run the app." So once the fetch cooldown comes off, I'm going to refetch and nothing happens. You can see there's a little bit of a progress bar there, but nothing actually ended up happening. And that's because GGG Stash APIs are not instantaneously updated. You do have to do something called a rezone. So what I just did there was I went from my hideout back to town and then back to my hideout. Technically, you don't have to do 2 rezones like I did. But what I just did there was force the Stash API to save the items as they are instead of having to wait a couple of minutes for that API to update automatically. I forced an update there. And so now if I refetch on the same exact tab, I have a full set. So if you're ever running into an issue where the number of sets that you have isn't accurate or it says you're missing items that you don't think you're missing, try a rezone and make sure that the stash data is the most up to date. So the second big feature that I wanted to talk about was our loot filter manipulation. We've talked about how we automate the process of going through your tabs and selecting the items needed to complete a full set for chaos. But before we can even get there, we do need to go into our maps and pick these items up off the ground. And that in and of itself is a super tedious process. So we're going to automate it. And the cool thing is this will work with filters that you get from Filter Blade, from other creators, templates that they've created and given to y'all. You can layer this on top of those pre-existing rules. So you want to go into the loot filter tab, enable this setting, and you can actually go in and select, let's say, never sync very strict filter. So there's a very strict filter that'll filter out a lot of the garbage bases for things like helmets and gloves and so forth, rings. Um, but I don't care if it's a bad base. I just need an unidentified, relatively high item level glove or helmet. You can see that that's the case with um, the current status of the items that I'm trying to gather. I also want to note that we have a setting here for keeping some of these items always active. By default, the rings, amulets, and belts come as always active. So these items, if you check those boxes, they will always be enabled on those loot filters, regardless of the base, regardless of whatever, as long as they're valid for the chaos recipe, which generally speaking means above item level 61. So with that being said, I've hooked up the filter, I've enabled the setting, and I made sure, I set my colors for those filters. I set an icon on the map. I'm going to save it. What I can do now is go into a map. Sorry, the lighting in my hideout is kind of buggy. Let me go ahead into the map. And I'm actually going to reload my item filter. And you can see here I got a confirmation message in my chat log that says, hey, you actually went ahead and reloaded your filter successfully. So now, certain items that I find, regardless of that never sync very strict rule, it's going to pop up because that's what I'm missing to complete my sets. And I could go through and show you guys exactly what I'm talking about, where it's respecting the rules. You can see there's a bow, there's a chess piece. This is all never sync with our application's logic layered on top. So I want to be clear that you do have to have a local filter file on your system. So it has to be an offline filter for you to use the filter manipulation feature. So you can see that in my games Path of Exile folder, I do have, my never sync filter that I just downloaded as a zip and extracted to this directory. I do also have these blue text filters that are the online filters on my Path of Exile account. Sadly, we don't support this. It's not possible to reasonably update these filters at a fast enough pace to get the quote unquote real time updates. So you do have to keep that in mind when using the filter manipulation. Has to be a local filter file, an offline filter, and not an online filter. Hey guys, I just want to thank you for watching this video guide. Hopefully it helped answer some of the questions you may have had when checking out the tool. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of settings that I didn't get to cover. Feel free to hop over to Discord. It's super active. I am always online, especially around the time that League launch is going to happen. And I'm always willing to hear out any sort of bugs that may have popped up, as well as new feature requests. And on that, I really would love to see if there are any other .NET developers or just developers in general that would be willing to kind of help out with the project. There's a lot of cool ideas that I have in mind, but open source is hard, especially when you got a full time job and you're trying to squeeze some time to juice up, the new expansions that are coming out. Because I do also play the game. But yeah, thanks again. Appreciate all your guys' support, and I'll see you guys in League.